right, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this introduction to renewable energy certificate tracking systems. My name is Todd Jones and I'm delighted to be joined today by two excellent speakers. We have Ms. Amy Fredregill, the Executive Director of Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System, or M-RETS, and Ms. Rachael Terada, a Senior Project Manager here at the Center for Resource Solutions. And I'll provide full introductions during the webinar. But today's webinar will provide an overview of renewable energy tracking systems. These are regional electronic databases that allow stakeholders to manage their portfolio of renewable energy certificates, or RECs, which confer environmental benefits and act as proof of generation. We'll talk about how they work and why renewable energy markets in the U.S. increasingly rely upon tracking systems. And we'll get an inside look at the M-RETS tracking system in particular. Just some logistics before we get started. We're going to go for about an hour. There will be about 35 minutes of presentations, and then we hope to have a good amount of time at the end for question and answers session. If you have a question, type it into the questions pane in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If we are not able to get to your question, or if you have questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us. We'll provide you with our contact information after webinar and throughout the webinar. And the slides from the presentation today will also be made available. So just a little background on the Center for Resource Solutions and M-RETS. CRS is a U.S.-based nonprofit. We were established in 1997 to create policy and market solutions to advance sustainable energy and climate change mitigation. We do this through a number of different programs and also by advocating for policies and market mechanisms that encourage clean energy and carbon emission reduction project development. We provide technical assistance to U.S. states and countries like China and India and the Philippines that are looking to build clean energy infrastructures. We also engage in education and outreach through consumer programs such as the Buy Clean Energy program and our annual Renewable Energy Markets Conference. But the largest programs here at CRS are the three market-leading Green E programs. Green E Energy was launched in 1998 and is leading North American certification for renewable energy. Green E Climate is a global retail standard and certification for carbon offsets in the voluntary carbon market. And Green E Marketplace began in 2004 working with commercial purchasers of renewable energy and carbon offsets to help recognize and verify and communicate their commitment to renewable energy and claims to carbon offsets. And the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking Systems, or M-RETS, tracks renewable energy generation and assists in verifying compliance with individual state or provincial or voluntary renewable portfolio standards, or RPSs. And it operates in, or it serves Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Manitoba, Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. As will be discussed further in this webinar, M-RETS uses verifiable production data for all participating generators and creates renewable energy credits, or RECs, in the form of a tradable digital certificate for each megawatt hour to keep track of renewable energy produced and delivered in the region to demonstrate compliance with state policies and to substantiate voluntary purchases of renewable energy. And you'll hear much more about tracking systems like M-RETS in the webinar today. So let's get started. I am going to turn it over to Ms. Rachael Terada, who will introduce tracking systems and describe how they work. In her role as Senior Project Manager, Rachael manages the annual verification of over 50 million megawatt hours of renewable energy transactions for the Green E Energy program and oversees the annual Renewable Energy Markets Conference. Her other projects include carbon footprint data analysis for Department of Defense facilities, technical paper development, and support for REC tracking systems. So take it away, Rachael.
Great. Thanks so much, Todd. I'm really happy to be joining you guys here on the webinar today. I'm going to be talking about sort of just an overview of tracking systems and RECs, what attributes are actually tracked on the certificates, how trading and retirement works, and I'll touch on how tracking systems are being used in the voluntary market. So first, let's make sure we get on the same page, because I know there are people on this webinar that are from different backgrounds. So renewable energy, it's clean, It's natural, naturally replenishing, and there are different forms of renewable energy. So most folks are typically familiar with renewable resources like wind and solar, but there are other resources too, like hydropower and geothermal power, using the heat of the earth to generate clean, renewable electricity. There's also biomass, and some people may or may not be familiar with biomass. It's just organic material that is either living or recently living that can be combusted to generate electricity. It might take a gaseous form or a non-gaseous form. So again, it is wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, hydropower, not nuclear. So although nuclear power is greenhouse gas emissions free, it's not considered renewable since it's not naturally replenishing. And fossil fuels are also not considered renewable energy. There are a lot of tracking systems that have been developed over the past 15 years, and they're all regionally based. So as you can see here on your screen, some of the tracking systems cover one particular state, others cover regions, and the first one was developed back in 2001 for the state of Texas. That's the ERCOT system. The most recent one that's being developed right now is New York's NIGAT system, so that's currently under development. All the tracking systems have similar functionality. Almost all were developed by the same software company, APX. But they have slightly different functionalities and capabilities. So they're tools that are used by regulators and voluntary program administrators to make sure folks that are wanting to make claims about renewable energy are doing so in an appropriate manner. They'll have different fees and costs associated with them, and different fee structures. Some are free, others charge flat fees, some charge per megawatt hour for certain types of transactions. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to how these systems are actually currently being used. So Todd had mentioned at the beginning of the call renewable portfolio standards. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more on the next slide. There's also some states use the tracking systems for fuel mix disclosure, and then they're also used by the voluntary market for renewable energy. There are 29 states plus DC and 2 U.S. territories that currently have a renewable portfolio standard, or an RPS. And basically what that is, if you're not familiar with that, is a certain, a state will mandate that a certain percentage of the electricity delivered to customers needs to be sourced from renewable resources like wind and solar. So it usually takes the form of X percent by Y date. And each state that's shaded in red here has a totally different standard, different percentage by a different date. For instance, California has a pretty aggressive RPS, and that is 33% by 2020. Other states might have, 10% by 2025. They all they all vary. And the mechanism that's used to keep track of all of this are what are known as renewable energy certificates, or RECs. What is a REC? What is a renewable energy certificate, or a REC? Well, for each megawatt hour of renewable electricity generation, a REC is created. It can be tracked and traded separately from the underlying electricity. It's just the way that renewable energy is tracked and traded in the United States. And each REC embodies all the environmental attributes associated with that renewable generation. If a REC is sold separately from the underlying electricity, that underlying electricity is no longer considered green. It's brown power, otherwise known as null power, and no renewable claim can be made on it. So you really need the REC to make any sort of renewable claim. So as I mentioned, for each megawatt hour of generation, one certificate is created. And in the tracking systems, they have a really helpful feature, which is that each megawatt hour, each REC, has its own unique serial number associated with it. And these RECs are tradable. There are different types of users for the renewable energy tracking systems. Not all users are listed here, but these are some of the more common ones. So generating facilities, so renewable energy generators, also energy service providers or utilities, also known as load-serving entities that are delivering electricity to customers. There are also renewable energy marketers, especially in the voluntary market, that use the tracking systems. And then there are state and voluntary program administrators. And these are the folks that are determining eligibility for programs, and also, the folks that are overseeing and making sure that any retirements that are being done are complying with their programs. I'm going to give you sort of an example here of one of the tracking systems. This is just a snapshot of PJM GATS, which is in the Mid-Atlantic. And you can see here that each facility has its own unique number associated with it. And you can see the plant name, there's a particular unit associated with it, where it's located, the fuel type, in this case solar PV, and you can also see what programs those facilities are eligible for. I do want to note that there are differences between the different tracking systems. So NEPOOL GIS and PJM GATS are what are considered all generation tracking systems. So those are here in the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic. Those tracking systems track all different types of generation, not just renewable energy. So they are tracking coal certificates and natural gas certificates, as well as wind certificates and solar certificates and geothermal certificates. The trading that typically takes place right now in those areas is, though, only for renewables. The rest of the tracking systems only track renewable energy generation, just renewables. So PJM GATS and NEPOOL GIS, and soon to be likely the New York NIGAT system, track all generation, and the rest of the systems track just renewables. What's actually being tracked on these certificates? I like to think of the attributes in two different types of categories. There are primary attributes that are explicitly tracked on their certificates, and then derived attributes that are included within the RECs but aren't necessarily explicitly tracked in the system. So those primary attributes that actually show up on the certificate would be fuel type, is it wind, is it solar, the vintage, when was the REC generated, and it's not typically, pretty much all monthly data that you'll see in the tracking system. It's not hourly data. It's just year and month. The facility location, and that is broken down by state, and any direct emissions that are associated with that electricity generation. That's more important in those all generation tracking systems, and which would also include some, some biomass facilities. For direct attributes, although the avoided carbon emissions are not explicitly tracked within the tracking system, or at least not for most of them, it does include those carbon benefits. The certificates also include, and we saw a little bit of a snapshot of that earlier, state program and Green E eligibility. And so those are the entities that are making determinations about whether or not a particular REC or a particular facility would be eligible for their program, for their RPS. What can you do with these certificates? Okay, so they're created in the tracking system, and then what? Well, they can be traded, and they can be retired. So they can be traded between different entities and traded between different accounts. And when a claim is going to be made on a REC, it becomes, it's what's known as retired. You need to retire a REC to be able to make a claim on it, whether that's for a state program or for a voluntary program. In the all-generation tracking systems for any certificates that aren't retired, and those would typically be, coal and any fossil fuel certificates or nuclear certificates, those can be converted into what's called a residual mix that gets shared with everybody else. How does this trading work? Well, in this situation, there are lots of different entities that have an account in the tracking system. So each person here, each little person with a letter on their chest is representing a different entity that would be in the tracking system. So this guy with a G on his chest would be a generating facility. Perhaps, so he's generating, say, wind RECs that get transferred to a wholesale entity, a wholesale supplier. It's this lady with a W on her, who maybe trades it to trades it to another entity, who trades it to another entity, who finally trades it to a load-serving entity, that's this guy with an L, who retires the certificates in the tracking system on behalf of the end-use customers. And as an example, you can see here, this is for a retirement report. So once a claim is being made on those RECs, they need to be retired. So they can be put into a retirement or a reserve sub-account. And you can see that they each REC has its own unique serial numbers associated with it, when it was generated, what the fuel type was, what the facility was, what program eligibilities there are, etc., and how many. You can also write in specific retirement reasons if that's required for a program. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how the voluntary market is currently using tracking systems. So as Todd mentioned at the beginning of the call, there's Green E. CRS operates the Green E certification programs, one of which is for renewable energy. And according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, we certify about 3/4 of the voluntary market in the U.S. And the last year of verification, 2012, that we have data for, that was equal to about 36 million megawatt hours for retail sales, and that is equivalent to powering about 1/3 of U.S. households for a month, which is quite a bit. We do certify about 98% of retail REC transactions in the voluntary market, so we have quite a bit of good data on this. And most of the majority of renewable energy that goes through our certification program is tracked in a tracking system. So not all RECs are in a tracking system, but at least for the voluntary market, the majority are. And I'm really glad that Amy's on the phone from M-RETS, because the participants in our program tend to use the M-RETS system quite a bit. And then we also use other tracking systems as well. To give you a sense of where those RECs are coming from, it tends to be in the middle of the country for large volumes. A lot of that is due to the fact that most of the supply for certified sales comes from wind facilities, and there are a lot of really great wind facilities in the middle of the country. In contrast to that, where the supply is coming from is where those megawatt hours are actually being sold, where the customers are located. And so this is showing where those customers are actually located. So we found that the voluntary market has been really helpful for pairing customers that may not be located right next to facilities to still have access to renewable energy generation. Just a couple of helpful resources that I want to clue you into that you may or may not be familiar with. ETNA, the Environmental Tracking Network of North America, We partnered with them quite a bit in the past, and there are some helpful white papers on the Aetna website. And we also host an annual Renewable Energy Markets Conference. And it's in a different city each year. This year we're going to be in Sacramento, California, on December 2nd through the 4th. We actually have a call for abstracts open right now, so I encourage you to check that out. And we will be discussing tracking systems more at that conference. We've had a lot of really great conversations at the last Renewable Energy Markets Conference. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Todd.
All right. Well, Rachel, we did have one clarifying question come in. Do you want to wait till the end okay, we'll wait till the end to do all the questions then. So please keep entering your questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. But right now, that was a great introduction, and now we have the privilege of hearing from Ms. Amy Fredregill of M-RETS. And she's going to put this all into context with the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System. Since September 2011, Amy has served as Executive Director and was the first employee for the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System based in St. Paul, Minnesota. In that role, she directs the day-to-day operations of M-RETS. Previously, she was Vice President of the Cooperative Network, a business trade association working with cooperative businesses, including electric cooperatives in the Upper Midwest, and she's also held positions as a legislative aide for the U.S. Senate and as a researcher for the Minnesota PUC, and she was appointed by Minnesota Governor Dayton to serve on the board for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. So, Amy, can you hear us? Are you able to speak?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you very much. All right. Well, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone, or I guess if you're west of me, or good morning. Happy to be here and tell you a little bit more about M-RETS. And Rachel provided a great overview of RECS, the tracking system, so I'll just make an attempt to compare and contrast M-RETS and drill more. To the next slide. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of M-RETS and our functions and how we compare with our peers, our RPSs and our footprint, and some statistics about the RECs that we track and the scope that we track, the data for our certificates and our stakeholders, the drivers for our registry activity, some developments on the horizon, and how to get more information and potentially be more involved if you'd like. Next slide. So Rachel showed you the map of all of our peers around the country, and as she mentioned, we are primarily regional in nature, with a couple of our tracking system peers being statewide. We are 9 states and Manitoba. We're primarily in the MISO footprint, or I guess I should say the MISO footprint before they recently added the MISO South states. So we are Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, the Dakotas, eastern half of Montana, Manitoba, Illinois. We just recently added Indiana, just barely getting a little activity there, and Ohio is eligible to track, although they do primarily choose to track with PJM gas. Next slide. So the mission statement of M-RETS is to efficiently track and verify renewable energy generation in collaboration with stakeholders, facilitating renewable energy development in the public interest. And the reason I like to mention our mission statement is because we are very focused on the needs of our stakeholders, and we are in constant contact with them to find out what their needs are for the tracking system. And I think one of the ways that we are able to do that very well is because we are a nonprofit, and we're actually independent of any other organization, ISO, balancing authority, RTO, governmental agency. We're not part of any other organization, and because of that, we're just very close to the needs of our stakeholders. We have essentially a kind of a representative democracy on our board. Our stakeholders do nominate the board members, and currently we're actually taking nominees for our investor-owned utility and municipal directors, as well as a couple of our governmental directors. And so our board is really kind of a three-legged balance stool comprised of state and provincial government, as well as 3 electric providers, an IOU, a muni, and a cooperative, and then a renewable energy marketer and a nonprofit. And so we have a small staff. There's 3 of us, and but we're not alone in the services we provide. We work with APX, who serves as our administrator, and so many of you that might have called our help desk in the past or working on registering some generation might have spoken with Brian Gower at APX. And so we are here based in Minnesota. Next slide, please. So Rachel mentioned that we verify production data for participating generators, and one thing that is not symmetrical throughout the country, and that does make M-RETS somewhat different than some other tracking systems, is that generators must register the units with M-RETS. We do not sweep all generation into M-RETS, and so you must register, create your account, become an account holder. We do have fees. Rachel mentioned that there's a range of how the stakeholders, the account holders, pay for fees. We have an annual subscription as well as REC issuance and REC retirement fees. So the idea is that we're sort of capturing the cost based on the amount of activity that an account holder is generating in the registry. And the generator must report 100% of the output from a registered unit to prevent double counting. And I think most of us with tracking systems would say that really our primary role is to ensure that there is no double counting of renewable energy certificates. Another thing that is a little bit unique is that we don't have any automatic retirement of RECs based on their age or their shelf life or the eligibility. And I'll get to this a little bit more in a minute, but the idea here is that the data for the age of a REC, the month, the year, the vintage that Rachel mentioned is all available on the REC in the data that's in the certificate. And the end user, whether it be a state or provincial jurisdiction or a voluntary buyer, would be able to look at that and know whether they would consider it eligible or not. But we don't automatically sweep the RECs into any retirement accounts because of age. And one thing that's interesting, I think we're at an interesting point right now, is we are just reaching to the point, because we first started tracking RECs in 2007, that we're even getting to the age where some of the RECs are starting to be reaching their shelf life. Before that, it wasn't anything that we even had to look at, because they were, we were all fairly new. And so we only track renewable energy generation, not all generation. That is something else that makes us unique. And so because we are only renewable energy, we primarily the generation we track does not emit anything, and so therefore we do not track emissions or carbon at this time. So next slide, please. Now, speaking of emissions, carbon being something that I wanted to mention, Rachel talked about the definition of a REC, and there is a little bit of a nuance around the country regarding the definition of a whole certificate. And so in M-RETS, we do require that all environmental attributes, all renewable attributes remain with the REC for it to be considered a whole certificate. So if carbon were to be peeled off and sold off, the account holder would no longer have a whole certificate. A couple other tracking systems are silent on the renewable attributes being with the REC, and so one of the things that we might want to talk about in the Q&A section is the transfer of RECs, the import and export of RECs between tracking systems, and we just have to make sure we're taking a look at the different definitions of RECs around the country as we move forward on that initiative. So next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit about how we first started tracking RECs in 2007. We are very rooted in RPS compliance, and I've just got a screenshot here of Desire, and I'm sure many of you have been to the Desire website and really focusing on RPS policies. That was really why the stakeholders came together. Starting in 2004, stakeholders in the Midwest began having listening sessions and stakeholder meetings to talk about the RPSs that were beginning to pop up around not only the country, but especially in the Midwest, of course, and how would we like to be complying with those those RPSs in a cost-effective and efficient way. And so the utilities and the governmental representatives and the renewable energy advocates came together and created what is essentially a quasi-governmental nonprofit organization. We were initially housed at one of our state commissions in Wisconsin, in fact, and we were formed, like I said, initially to ensure that states and utilities with a compliance obligation had a tool for RPS compliance. And so that's certainly not the only thing that we do. We don't just track for RPS compliance, but that was the key driver, the key demand that was pushing us forward in our initial founding years. So next slide, please. So one thing that One thing that we really emphasize, we talk about this a lot with our board, is that in the policies that we pass and look at from kind of an operating procedure level, is that we are policy neutral. We are not the legislators. We are not the regulators. We are running a database that tracks information on renewable energy and trying to make reports available for the end users of RECs. So we do not partake in any advocacy at state legislatures. We do also, this is kind of an interesting nuance that I think not everyone realizes, we don't determine eligibility for state or provincial programs. In fact, what determines eligibility for a program is either the state statute or rules or other guidance that a commission or a state agency has put forth. So a generating unit is considered renewable if the energy generated is considered renewable by the jurisdiction, by the receiving jurisdiction, and that, of course, could be either in the compliance or the voluntary markets. So really what makes us tick is that we have software underlying and as an underpinning to our registry, so we're very nimble. Of course, software is changing all the time. It makes us very dynamic, so if an RPS statute was amended or adopted, we work with stakeholders to determine if changes need to be made to either add a fuel type, add anything else about a nuance about what that state has just amended their RPS statute. So next slide, please. So this, Rachel mentioned this already. I don't have a whole lot more specific to add about our primary stakeholders. She really covered this. So only a couple other subsets that are a little more nuanced that I would call out is that we definitely have distributed generators and aggregators in M-RETS, and we also, some of our stakeholders also include nonprofits that are interested in renewable energy, and other than that, our primary stakeholder groups are the ones that Rachel already mentioned. So we can move on to the next slide. So we're always making sure that we're balancing the needs of voluntary and mandatory stakeholders. We get asked a lot about what the top drivers are of activity in M-RETS. So approximately 70% of the REC activity going through M-RETS is driven by regulatory compliance, and we're working on getting some even more refined metrics on that. But what we do know definitely is that the RPSs in this order, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, Minnesota being number 1, Wisconsin number 2, Illinois number 3, are the top drivers for REC retirement. But we also may track anything that the voluntary market deems renewable. So you heard from Rachael and all the work they do with Green E certification. And so you probably have seen, you might have seen NREL will put out reports periodically about growth in the voluntary markets. Over time, the range of the growth rates has been between 10 and 25% for growth in the voluntary marketplace. And I think we're about in the middle there. We're like I said, trying to get more metrics to pin down our voluntary market growth rate. But it's definitely the growth area, and we do match our peers around the country in that. So for the voluntary marketplace, we have a couple of services that are particularly geared towards them. We offer a bulletin board where buyers and sellers can connect, so you can post RECs for sale on the M-RETS website. We are not a trading platform. The REC trades do occur bilaterally outside of M-RETS, and as such, we do not track REC prices, but we are seeing increasingly that some of the states in our footprint are asking for REC price information from the generators in their state, and so that isn't anything we necessarily track in M-RETS, but I know there's a lot of interest there as well. So next slide, please. little bit more about M-RETS. We're certainly not the biggest tracking system in the country, but we are growing, and of course that's primarily a virtue of the step-ups in the state RPSs around the country every year. So in 2013, there were 73 million RECs that were issued and 31 million RECs retired. We currently have 207 accounts with 608 projects, and 25% of those are under 1.5 megawatts. In 2013, we had 44 new projects registered, and most of those, the majority of those, were under 1.5 megawatts as well. Next slide, please. So being a database, we obviously are very concerned about always having very high quality data. And I always like to think about somebody was giving out pins at the Renewable Energy Markets Conference last fall in Austin that said, "I heart data." So we like to think that that's kind of a pinnacle of M-RETS being data-driven. The majority of our data does come from MISO. So when an account holder registers with M-RETS, they fill out and return a MISO release form, which essentially allows us to access that generator's settlement data in the MISO system. We do have a couple of qualified reporting entities that are reporting on behalf of account holders, and for distributed generators, the information is self-reported for the most part. And fuel sources and other characteristics are entered by the generator and verified through different feasibility checks by our administrator. Next slide, please. So just a couple other things, and then I'll wrap up for Q&A. We saw the chart earlier, the national map of all the RPSs, and M-RETS, like many regions of the country, has a mix of mandates and voluntary objectives or goals. And so, of course, if you're interested in finding more information about our specific RPSs, you can certainly find that on the Desire website. So, next slide, please. So just a few comments about some things that are trends and themes that we're seeing and topics on the horizon. So not dissimilar from around the country, we are seeing an uptick in distributed generation and the aggregation thereof. Of course, with the Minnesota Solar Energy Standard being passed just a year ago and working its way through the regulatory process and rulemaking process now, we're definitely seeing an increase in solar in Minnesota as well as distributed generation throughout the M-RETS footprint. So we're working with stakeholders to make sure that we're meeting their needs, and that if there's any modifications we might need to make to accommodate just different business models and our operating procedures, that we're considering all input there. We're also working on policies to transfer RECs between regions, so we call that the import and export of RECs between tracking systems. Just last week, our board approved imports from Michigan. And we're always working with our stakeholders to modify our software and make sure that we're enhancing the system so that it's meeting the modern needs that they have. And just in a couple weeks here, we'll be hearing from President Obama about some EPA standards for greenhouse gases. So we're monitoring that and just especially making sure that no matter how greenhouse gases will ultimately be tracked in the future, that there's no double counting of RECs with an increasing compliance needs for greenhouse gas and other environmental attributes. And then just another hot topic that we are looking at policies as regarding the backloading or retroactive RECs, how far back data can be used to upload generation and projects into our system. Next slide, please. So just wanted to let you know where you can find out more information about M-RETS at mrets.org. We do have 5 different public reports. The link to that is on our homepage. And there's lots of great information here. We continue to try to make more and more information available. So if you have any questions, please let me know, or I can always connect you with Brian Gower, who is our administrator at APX. Next slide. And if you'd like to get more involved and you actually are a stakeholder in the Midwest, or you'd just like to hear more about what we're up to, we do have quarterly conference calls for our subscriber group. That's our stakeholder group. And the next one is at 1:30 Central on June 12th. The information to register is available on our website, and all stakeholders are welcome. And with that, I will pass it back to Rachel.
Great, and I'm going to pass it over to Todd.
All right.
Great.
So thanks so much, Amy. That was great. So at this point, I think we are going to move into the question and answer period. We've already had a number of good questions come in, and I think I'll sort of start off with some clarifying questions just based on some of the presentations we've heard already. We did have a question come in about all generation tracking systems. Some folks are looking for a little bit more information about all generation tracking systems versus some of the other tracking systems which just track renewable energy. We did have a specific question about coal RECs. Is there something, is a coal REC something, is that a thing?
So there isn't a coal REC, but there are coal certificates. To have a REC, it needs to be, I mean, the definition, just in the word, is renewable energy certificate. So there, it has to be from a renewable resource to be considered eligible to have a REC issued. But in those all generation tracking systems, there are certificates issued for every type of generation, whether that's coal or natural gas or nuclear or wind or solar. The ones that are renewable, from renewable resources, those are considered RECs, renewable energy certificates, and the rest typically end up getting retired and all put together into something called a residual mix, where all the residual mix certificates have the same characteristics, and they're mishmash of you know, a certain percentages from coal, a certain percentages from natural gas, etc.
All right, great. So Amy, this question's for you, I think, or I'll pass it to you anyway. Question about APX. Just looking for some more information about who they are, what's the difference between APX and M-RETS, what do they do for you guys?
Oh, great. Thanks for the question. So APX is a contractor of M-RETS, and they did build the software that underpins the, most of the tracking systems around the country. And Rachel mentioned that a little bit earlier on in the webinar. They have a couple different parts of their business. They operate a power management business, and they operate registries for environmental attributes, RECs and carbon being the two primary areas of business for their registries. And so they're a contractor of M-RETS, and many of you know, if you are M-RETS account holders, that Brian Gower answers the M-RETS helpline and kind of the call center. And so they're a great partner of ours, and I'm sure their website has all kinds of great information about them as well, if folks are interested.
All right. And we got a question about what you said, Amy, about Missouri is in the MISO. If they're in the MISO, why are they not a part of M-RETS?
Well, Missouri actually is tracking with the North American Renewables Registry, NAR, and that is an APX-run tracking system. And I believe it's represented on the broader national map that we had up earlier of all tracking systems. So that's a bit of their history. The MISO South states that just joined the MISO footprint was just effective in December, and there's not a lot of renewable generation with and with mandates in those areas, and so we haven't been working with them a whole lot just yet. But Missouri certainly is working with NAR, and I suppose we'll see about the rest of the states.
All right, great. Well, let's talk about carbon for just a second. I guess I'll open this up to either Amy or Rachel. Jump in whenever you like. We got a couple of questions about avoided emissions, looking for a little bit more information on what those are, what sort of resources we're talking about when we're talking about avoided emissions from what, and then, more generally, sort of the relationship between RECs and carbon, and what sort of carbon claims can maybe be made. So if either of you want to jump in on that.
Rachel, do you want to speak to the other tracking systems more generally that do track avoided emissions? Or would you like me to start?
So you go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, so as I mentioned, M-RETS does not track carbon or emissions because we just track renewables, but some of our peers, particularly PJM, EIS GATS, and MEPOOL, because they touch on the RGGI states, the states that have the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory, do have, because they're tracking all generation, and they do apply emissions factors to that fossil fuel-based generation to come up with an emission rate for those RECs. I can't say a whole lot more about that because those aren't, I don't work for them, but I do know just in talking to my peers and learning about what they do, that's a little bit about how they work. Let's see, the second part of that question was how carbon relates to RECs, and as I mentioned in my slide that showed the graphic of kind of a REC, a certificate, we do include all environmental attributes, including carbon, all greenhouse gases, in the definition of a whole REC. And so if we were to be accepting an import, for example, from a tracking system that is silent on those attributes, for example, North Carolina is silent on the definition of environmental attributes being included in the REC, we would need to have attestations or other ways to ensure that that carbon is still retained with the REC.
Great, thanks, Amy, for that. Just to add on to all that great information. So within a REC, that does include avoided carbon emissions. So what are you backing down? Sort of what that's getting at for other types of generation on the grid. And in terms of claims and carbon claims, and I don't know if people on the call are familiar with WRI, and they have different scopes for different types of emissions. When you're doing greenhouse gas accounting, there's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 is for everything that's under your control. Scope 2, so that's like your Scope 1 is like your tailpipe emissions. Scope 2 is for any purchased energy, and Scope 3 is for everything else. And so RECs are really used, at least in the U.S., for to match up reducing your Scope 2 emissions. So for every megawatt hour of energy that you're using, if you're at least in the voluntary market, if you're purchasing RECs to match up with your energy use, then you can zero out your greenhouse gas emissions for your Scope 2 claims. And then carbon offsets, on the other hand, can be used for Scopes 1, 2, or 3.
Right, so just to clarify, I'll take the moderator's prerogative here to add a little bit more information. So as Rachel described, when we're talking about RECs, we're talking about, and carbon at least, we're talking about sort of two different attributes. And one is the sort of direct emissions associated with the REC, which are usually zero, so you can claim to be using zero emitting power. And again, that's a Scope 2 claim, like Rachel described. I'm using electricity that doesn't emit any carbon. And then avoided emissions, a little bit more complicated in terms of how it's calculated, at least in the voluntary market. We're usually talking about the grid average of the location where the REC is generated, in terms of figuring out what resources are being backed down. And again, that avoided emissions claim, just to be clear, is different than an emissions reduction claim that you get with a carbon offset. Basically, you're just claiming the benefits of the generation, and that generation backs down other sources on the grid. So you get to say that the power you're using avoids emissions on the grid. You don't necessarily get to say that you're reducing emissions the way you would with a carbon offset. But those are two very important claims for REC purchasers in the voluntary market, and significant drivers in the market as well. We got a bunch of more questions come in. One question about Canadian generation. How is Canadian generation handled in these systems?
Well, go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I was just going to say pretty much just like the U.S. generation. But Amy, since you have a territory in M-RETS. Why don't you speak to the specific?
Sure.
M-RETS?
Sure, yeah, and as just not too dissimilar from how we track any generation. All of our generation does show the location, and so of course the location of ours would be in Manitoba. We do have hydro from Manitoba tracked in M-RETS, and so just like any other data point on a REC, it shows the location of that generation, and not a whole lot of other nuance otherwise.
All right. We got a question about cogeneration. Cogeneration as a renewable resource? Yes, no, or if it's considered renewable, what if the fuel is renewable, landfill or digester gas or biofuel?
Yeah, so each state sets their own requirements for what can be considered renewable, and so some of those states that is completely fine. And there are also other types of certificates that can be tracked within the tracking systems, like energy efficiency. For instance, Connecticut tracks energy efficiency within the NEET pool system.
Kevin, I would just chime in. Definitely different state by state, and we have a range of those differences in M-RETS. I think Ohio is one that has a little more of a unique policy, and from both with cogen and, as Rachel mentioned, some new approaches to energy efficiency tracking and counting towards some of the state policies. So for anything like that, what we would do is, as I mentioned, we're software, and so we would work with APX to modify our software to make sure that those types of generation, fuel types, attributes, you name it, are being tracked as data points in our system, and that the reports that any jurisdiction would need to see to determine eligibility would be available through our reports and our data.
All right. Let's see here. We got a bunch more come in. Amy, you mentioned transferring RECs between tracking systems, and you mentioned some specific developments. But could you talk a little bit more about the status of being able to transfer RECs between tracking systems, and are there particular tracking systems where there or relationships between certain tracking systems where that works especially well, or where that's not possible at the moment?
Sure. And if you'd like a visual aid, I do have, I think my last slide is on imports and exports, if you want to just pull that up on the screen. Thanks. So, I mentioned that all the tracking systems have a little bit different definition of a whole certificate. That's just one example of some of the unique nuances that all of our tracking systems have. Because we are 50 states. Every state is different. Every regional tracking system or the state tracking systems are all a little bit different too. And so we've made an effort over the years to try to work together to enable the free flow and liquidity of RECs between the systems. But just because we have different state laws and state definitions, and our own regional tracking systems are a little bit different, it's not as easily said than done. But having said that, we do export currently to Michigan, North Carolina, and the North American Registry, and we had about a third increase in our number of exports recently. And now we're really turning our efforts to getting imports approved into M-RETS, and so just taking a look at what we need to do to, what are the differences in data that's tracked between the systems, what are the different definitions. As I mentioned, we really pride ourselves in being policy neutral, and so we try to pass policies that aren't necessarily judging certain attributes. We're just saying that we're making data available for the end users in the jurisdictions, and then they can determine eligibility. And so all of that information will be available. The origin registry, the origin state of a REC is available on that data for that certificate. And so just recently we added Michigan as a compatible tracking system. So we continue to work with our peers around the country, and we're working on this for the next year or two probably, and we'll just kind of keep picking away at it to the extent that it's feasible.
Thanks, Amy. That's great. I'm actually really excited that you guys are now trading or being able to trade with MyREX. That's great. And sort of touching, jumping off of what Amy was talking about, it isn't so much, it isn't really a technical, so much of it, although there are technical things to match up, it isn't, since all these platforms were developed by the same software company, that really not terribly difficult to match things up. It's more of a question of, each tracking system wanting to make a decision to have those imports and exports, and then once those decisions are made, then figuring out the details. So I'm really excited that this is taking place more and more. It creates a little bit more of a more liquid market. So feeling really encouraged by that.
So along those same lines, thinking about imports and exports and thinking about cooperation between these regional tracking systems, we got a question about a standard for tracking systems, or something that could sort of bring all of these tracking systems together. Do we need a national tracking system? Are we on our way there, or is that helpful? Would that be helpful?
Yeah. So this is Rachael. This question comes up every year or so as something that people would really like to see, and we all get our heads together and try to figure out can we make that happen. And the bottom line is that it likely is not something that's going to happen until we have a federal renewable portfolio standard. So just from talking with different tracking system operators, it doesn't seem like there will be one standard across all tracking systems. However, it does, I'm very encouraged by the imports and exports that are happening, and also there isn't really a desire to create one new tracking system, even if we did get a federal RPS. The tracking systems that are in place have a lot of great capabilities and functionalities, and have already done all the work to form those relationships with, the independent system operators and the qualified reporting entities, and getting all that meter data in. So they've already done all the legwork.
All right. So speaking of federal regulation, can we talk about 111D here for just a second? I would just like to know, how the upcoming explanation and announcement regarding 111D and of the Clean Air Act is going to affect tracking systems, or if it will affect tracking systems, or how we think it will affect tracking systems in advance of this announcement.
Yeah, I can chime in there. So I think you probably hear this ad nauseum, but everyone's really sort of in a wait-and-see posture right now with EPA coming out with Clean Air Act Section 111D rules in really less than a couple weeks now. And so it remains to be seen exactly what will be rolled out. And of course, M-RETS being, as I mentioned, very stakeholder responsive, we will just be listening and learning from what our stakeholders want and what they're interested in doing. And I mentioned on one of my slides, kind of trends on the horizon, that our bottom line is always to prevent the double counting of RECs. And so no matter how 111D ends up being implemented from a compliance perspective, with greenhouse gas being tracked by someone, somewhere, somehow, we just need to make sure that those, the carbon and any greenhouse gases that also relate to the environmental attributes of a whole certificate are not double counted. And so our board of directors, we have a strategic plan that we're always guided by and listening to what our stakeholders need. And so perhaps if there's an interest there, and M-RETS getting involved as a regional entity and tracking some of those for compliance efforts, if that's something that we could certainly look at down the road. But like I said, everyone's just kind of in a wait-and-see posture right now.
All right, we have about 1 more minute for questions. We got 2 quick questions that came in here. So one is about RECs. 1 REC equals 1 megawatt-hour of renewable generation. What about mixed fuel generation? If some's renewable and some is not, what happens there? Do they get RECs?
Only the renewable portion gets RECs.
Okay, only the renewable portion gets RECs. And about regarding the map that we saw of all the different tracking systems, several of the participants noticed that some states are split in half: Montana, South Dakota, Illinois, and Ohio. How does that happen? Why does that happen? And why are these not all on state lines?
Yeah, it's because regional grids don't operate on state lines, so those maps pretty much follow the, if you look at like Regis, it follows the Western Electricity Coordinating Council region, for instance. So they're regionally based grids, and the tracking systems, for the most part, tend to follow those. Some of the state-specific ones don't as much.
All right. Well, I think we're going to end there. But before we do, I just wanted to let you guys know about an upcoming webinar, our next webinar, which is our Introduction to the Greening Marketplace program. It's going to be on June 12th. So please join us for that. We're also going to have upcoming introductions to greening energy, Carbon Offsets 101 in August, a Renewable Energy 101 in September. So please visit us at resource-solutions.org/events to register for those. And again, if we didn't get to your questions, or if you have questions now, please feel free to contact us. Our information is up on the site or up on your screen now. And the slides from the presentation will be made available to you. So I'd like to thank you and thank our speakers, Rachael, Terada, and Amy Fredregill, for a fantastic webinar. Please join our upcoming webinars, and thank you so much.
Thank you.